everybody, it is Friday, June 14th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Winunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, we should begin with the biggest headline of the day. It is your birthday. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Moshe. And you know who I share a birthday with, right?
Yes, I actually looked it up. Donald Trump turned 78 today, so it is also his birthday today. You also share a birthday with Steffi Graf. Remember the tennis player, Steffi Graf?
Oh, that I didn't know.
And the revolutionary Che Guevara. He's no longer with us, but there you go, historically speaking.
Well, Moshe, I appreciate the birthday wishes, and let me be the first to wish you a happy Father's Day. Your first official.
Thank you. I'm very excited. I've realized as we go through this for the first time, we had Mother's Day mid-May. It was my birthday a week after that. Now I got Father's Day. So I sort of know how the people feel who have like their birthdays during Christmas season, where like everything is all together.
It's a lot, I gotta say. And even with my birthday being this weekend, it's just like, we're still celebrating. Haven't we been now celebrating for weeks?
Yes, we should celebrate like you that every day, Jill. And I think I know of a great gift. Anyone on the podcast listening right now who wants to give Jill the birthday gift of subscribing to her new Long Island newsletter.
Oh, yes. Okay. I didn't know where you were going to go. I thought you were going to say a Mo News bucket hat.
No. Yes. Go to the Mo News merch shop, mo.news/merch, and buy a bucket hat and then send it to Jill. That seems a bit aggressive. There's an easy way to show your support for Jill on her birthday by heading over to her new Enclave newsletter. Jill, what's the URL on that?
enclavenews.com. Sign up. You will not be disappointed. And Moshe, I can't even ask you what you want for Father's Day because I feel like Alex, your wife, is just so on top of gifts and things.
She says she has a surprise for me, so I'm looking forward to finding out what that is on Sunday. But listen, I think honestly, as a new dad, I just enjoy, time with Olivia, with Alex, and I wish everyone the same this weekend.
And with that, let's get to a jam-packed news podcast. The Supreme Court rejects a challenge to the abortion pill Mifepristone. It is a win for the abortion rights movement, but it is certainly not the end of the story. What is next in the legal battle over abortion? Meanwhile, down the street, the Senate rejects a push to legally protect access to in vitro fertilization. And Donald Trump returns to Capitol Hill for what turned into an airing of the grievances. And Moshe, it is not even Festivus.
It's been a while since the Seinfeld reference, Jill. I like it.
Lots of Russia news. A U.S. sub pulls into Guantanamo Bay a day after Russian warships arrive in Cuba.
By the way, everyone, that sounds scary. We'll tell you why not to be that worried about that.
Meanwhile, U.S. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was jailed in Russia on espionage charges, is now set to officially stand trial. And the G7 summit is happening in Italy. Leaders agree to lend Ukraine billions of dollars backed by Russia's frozen assets. But is it legal? And back here at home, the F.A.A. admits that its previous oversight of Boeing was, quote, too hands-off. A bit of space research on how even a few days in space impacts our body. And here's a new one. Wells Fargo has fired some employees for allegedly faking work by simulating keyboard activity. Moshe, I can't wait to try this one out.
Jill, we're not running that tight a ship here.
Jill's been typing on Slack for a while. No message, though. It's weird. Tennis star Roger Federer's commencement address going viral.
And we should note, this is an athlete's commencement speech that's going viral for a good reason.
Plus, it is Friday. Cheers to the freaking weekend, what we are watching, reading, and eating. All right, a major ruling from the Supreme Court as they come to the end of this year's term. On Thursday, the court unanimously rejected a challenge to the abortion pill Mifepristone. All 9 justices in agreement yesterday. So this means that the commonly used drug can remain widely available, including allowing the pills to be mailed to patients without an in-person doctor's visit. It is important to note that the court didn't actually rule on the topic at hand, which was a group of anti-abortion doctors that brought the lawsuit and argued that the FDA overreached by making Mifepristone more easily accessible. So the court not exactly weighing in on the FDA's action there. Instead, the court found that the group of anti-abortion doctors didn't have legal standing to sue. Writing the unanimous decision, conservative Justice Brett Kavanaugh said that the plaintiffs failed to show that they had suffered any injury, meaning that, quote, the federal courts are the wrong forum for addressing their concerns about FDA's actions. He added that the plaintiffs do not prescribe or use Mifepristone, but still wanted the FDA to make it harder for other doctors to prescribe it and women to receive it. He says, quote, under Article 3 of the Constitution, a plaintiff's desire to make a drug less available for others does not establish standing to sue. So the bottom line here, this lawsuit will be dismissed. And another decision lets women obtain the pill within 10 weeks of gestation instead of 7. The FDA first approved the pill back in 2000. It is now used in more than 60% of U.S. abortions. And since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade back in 2022, medications to terminate pregnancy have grown in importance, and they've also become a major target of litigation.
But while the court wanted to end the issue for them to deal with back in 2022 by overturning Roe v. Wade, kicking it to the states, they saw this case. This will not end the issue anytime soon. By throwing out the case on standing, saying that these folks were not injured by the law, and so therefore they have no standing to sue, that now kicks it back to potential litigants who do show injury in some way, shape, or form, and could sue on legal merits of the FDA rules themselves. It appears this case was a test balloon, and there are a whole bunch of legal groups out there that have made it their cause to find holes in the law here as they continue their fight against Mifepristone. So another thing we'll be looking at, and we dive into this over on the Instagram feed, is whether groups now will pursue something under what's called the Comstock Act. That's something you'll be hearing more about this summer and fall. It's an 1873 anti-obscenity law that is technically still on the books. They call it a zombie law because aspects of it have been removed, but it still is technically on the federal books. Now, back in 1873, the Comstock law banned the mailing of obscene materials, including anything used for the prevention of conception or for causing unlawful abortion. Again, this law being more than 150 years old. And so there's a lot of interpretation here. There's a lot of legal experts that say that precedent at this point is to ignore the Comstock law that is technically on the books but not enforceable. That's something the Biden administration has said. At the same time, you have conservatives and anti-abortion activists who believe that the Comstock law actually provides an easy path for a total national ban on abortion and contraception. Technically, a future president could direct the Department of Justice to enforce the Comstock Act and then push to get a conservative Supreme Court to back them up on legal challenges. If they went the Supreme Court route, that would be a total ban on abortion, contraception, anything deemed obscene. And that's something that Democrats are worried about. And a number of Republicans say they have no intention to pursue. But at the same time, there are, again, social conservatives that are pushing this idea that they think the Comstock law can get them to where they want to on an issue like Mifepristone and abortion writ large. We should note the Trump campaign has been asked about the Comstock law, has had no comment on it. But it does mean that in the interim, you do see Democrats talking about repealing completely the Comstock law, which again has not been enforced for a very long time. And so Senator Schumer has talked about doing that in the Senate. Whether that would then pass a House is unclear because the Republicans control the House, but just something you might be hearing about in the coming months.
Staying with reproductive health news, just across the street from the Supreme Court yesterday, the U.S. Senate rejected a push to legally protect access to in vitro fertilization. Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth, who used IVF to have 2 children, introduced the Right to IVF Act. It would have barred states from adding restrictions to IVF and required that insurance plans cover the fertility treatment, which can run thousands of dollars out of pocket. Senators failed to reach the 60-vote threshold needed to move forward with the legislation. The result was expected because Senate Republicans nearly unanimously opposed it, although 2 moderate Republicans voted in favor, Senator Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. Republicans accused Democrats of drafting overly broad legislation designed to score political points and scare voters. Ahead of the vote, all 49 Senate Republicans signed a letter backing IVF, saying it's already legal and there is no need for the bill. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, though, a Democrat from New York, had promised to bring up a series of votes to protect women's reproductive health this summer. a move that would certainly be popular with a big cohort of voters ahead of the November election. He says this should have been an easy vote for Republicans. Democrats say the IVF protections were needed to head off fresh challenges to the procedure.
Yeah, it comes, as we told you yesterday, about the vote from the Southern Baptist Convention. That's the largest Protestant group in the country, representing over 12 million evangelicals. They voted to oppose the procedure, arguing that the frozen embryos that are either left in limbo or destroyed are equivalent to destroying a human life. Of course, they still said that members of the church could do it, but they officially, as a church, opposed the procedure. That's something that they share in common with the Catholic Church. It also comes, as we told you, about the situation earlier this year in Alabama, where the Alabama Supreme Court found that frozen embryos can be considered children. That prompted the state very quickly to clarify this and clarify that IVF was legal. Again, you're going to see a whole bunch of this in the coming weeks and months. House Republicans doing stuff on the House side, taking these votes that they know aren't going to go anywhere. Here on the Senate side, you saw Democrats do this, and Republicans are saying, you're playing a bunch of politics here. We all support IVF, but we don't feel that this legislation here is necessary because it also goes beyond the core goal of protecting IVF access. And they question the price tag for taxpayers when it comes to having insurers pay for IVF. The Democrats, of course, saying that they're looking to make the procedure more accessible, more affordable for patients. And Senate Republicans, we mentioned back IVF in principle, but there are, again, some anti-abortion groups that view embryos as human life and don't think the practice aligns with traditional pro-life values. So Republicans feeling they need to ride the line there. They've been pushing their own alternative bill related to protecting IVF. Again, IVF is legal here, but you see the two parties here talking about it, especially Democrats have seen opportunity here in the fall to make it an issue out of what happened in Alabama, out of what happened at the Baptist Convention, out of this vote in the Senate. Republican lawmakers seeing this as a vulnerability. There was actually an internal memo leaked earlier this year that called on Senate Republicans to express support for IVF and campaign for increasing access, knowing how popular it is.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump was back on Capitol Hill meeting with Republicans. It was his first time back since January 6th, 2021. And he got a warm welcome with standing ovations and even a fist bump with Mitch McConnell. Notable because they've had a frosty relationship, to say the least.
Jill, you could say that. Mitch McConnell basically said that he had no business being president after January 6th, and Donald Trump has been trashing him dozens and dozens of times, his wife saying some really offensive stuff about Mitch McConnell on social media and in speeches the past couple of years.
Moshe, it's been described by reporters who were briefed on some of the closed-door meetings as a bit of an airing of the grievances by Trump. So he apparently complained about some of his legal and electoral challenges. He attacked critics in the room. He reportedly took a swipe at House Republicans who had voted to impeach him back in 2021, noting that not many of them were left in Congress. And then somehow he managed to bring up Taylor Swift, saying that he signed a bill during his time in office that would help songwriters. And so he was surprised that Swift hadn't endorsed him or that Swift wasn't supporting him. And then Moshe added that his rallies could draw bigger crowds than Swift could.
Big claim.
Is that a challenge? I don't know.
Sounds like a challenge. I don't know. Based on what we're seeing with the latest part of her European tour, I think he might have some difficulty there. Apparently, according to one report, Jill, he called Biden a dope. And he's like, I can't believe she's endorsing this dope. Officially, by the way, we should note, Taylor has not endorsed, but I guess he doesn't seem very bullish, especially after these comments. It's probably unlikely that she chooses to endorse him based on some of her recent endorsements. Jill, one other serious issue he brought up during his time talking to Republican lawmakers, abortion. It's an issue that Trump has acknowledged both publicly and privately. He knows is not great for Republicans, even though he did put in the 3 Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. He said that he wants Republicans to talk about it, quote, correctly, stress the support for exceptions in the room. He says that the issue has cost them politically. It's too important to ignore. The Democrats are the two radicals here. We need to be a party of common sense. And then, Jill, they sang him happy birthday. Apparently, they gave him a cake with 45 candles and then with 47 candles. Remember, he was the 45th president, and he hopes to now be the 47th president since Biden's the 46th president. So they gave him a little happy birthday rendition.
Okay, time now for the speed read. This from the Associated Press, a situation we are watching just off the coast of Cuba. A U.S. Navy submarine has arrived in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, in a show of force as a fleet of Russian warships gather for planned military exercises in the Caribbean. U.S. Southern Command said that the USS Helena, a nuclear-powered fast attack submarine, pulled into the waters near the U.S. base in Cuba on Thursday. It comes a day after a Russian frigate, a nuclear-powered submarine, an oil tanker, and a rescue tug conducted drills in the Atlantic. The Pentagon says the stop is part of a, quote, routine port visit as the submarine travels through Southern Command's regions.
Yeah, routine. As in,
just happened to be in town.
Hey, Putin. FYI, here's our nuclear submarine. Other U.S. ships have been tracking and monitoring the drills. Pentagon officials say they do not represent a threat to the U.S. They say it is no surprise. They take it seriously, but these exercises, again, do not pose a threat. Keep in mind, we do a lot of exercises, and Putin doesn't love all the action in his backyard all the time, with NATO basically being on his entire border these days. So it appears he's trying to send a message here. It comes less than 2 weeks after President Biden authorized Ukraine to use U.S.-provided weapons to strike inside Russia. That's something Putin suggested his military could respond to with what he called asymmetrical steps elsewhere in the world. The drills, the Russian drills, took place in international waters. They do expect that after Cuba, the Russian ships could remain in the region. They could stop in Venezuela. Remember, Russia is a longtime ally of Venezuela and Cuba, so it sometimes sends boats, warships into the neighborhood. They've occasionally docked there the last few years. So just FYI for those of you in my Instagram DMs following some TikTokers who are calling this World War III, it is not World War III. It is not the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're just moving boats around like a game of Battleship without planning to shoot each other.
Look at you trying to turn the temperature down, Moshe. I appreciate it.
I try to do that every day. It's like I should just open up my Instagram feed every day and this podcast every day with being like with a couple statements, including there is no World War III. There will be no World War III. Now for the rest of the news.
I have had some Moshe pep talks or reality checks in the past few months, and they really help. I will say.
You're a VIP. You get the pep talks. You get the personal pep talks, Jill. Especially on your birthday.
Okay, staying with Russia. Russian prosecutors finalized the espionage indictment against imprisoned American journalist Evan Gershkovich. He will be tried in the Russian city where he was arrested more than a year ago. In a statement, the prosecutors say they have determined and confirmed that, quote, under instructions from the CIA and using secrecy methods, Gershkovich was collecting secret information about a factory that produces tanks and other weapons in one of the Russian regions. Gershkovich is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, which, along with the U.S. government, is strongly denying the charge against him and say that he is being wrongfully imprisoned.
Yeah, God knows what the Russians are talking about here. He's a reporter who was covering things in Russia. They're claiming he's a spy. Russian authorities have been using this more and more, including Russian authorities, overseen, of course, by President Putin, more and more have been doing these arrests. Brittany Griner, remember that one. They're holding several Americans right now. He has suggested he's open to a prisoner swap for Gershkovich, but only after a verdict is handed down. It is unclear who Putin would want, who the U.S. could offer. There's been talk of somebody who's being held in a German prison. Would the Germans coordinate here? Unclear, but sadly for Gershkovich, he's been behind bars here. Again, the U.S. saying wrongful imprisonment for more than a year, and he faces up to 20 years in a Russian prison if he's convicted here, which, the way Russian courts work, is pretty much a certainty.
Staying overseas and on the topic of Russia, from CNN, President Biden and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky spoke Thursday after signing a bilateral security agreement on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. Biden is vowing to stand by Ukraine. The deal lays out a path for the U.S.'s long-term security relationship with Kyiv, but it could also be undone by future U.S. administrations. This is according to multiple people who are familiar with its details.
Yeah, there's a lot of concern out there that what Trump has been saying, which is he's going to end the war in one day, just give him 24 hours. And in fact, we try to move on after more than the 2-year battle here. The Ukrainians, NATO allies are very concerned that that could mean that he gives a lot to Putin, allows him to take a whole bunch of Ukraine. And so there's a lot of nervousness on the part, especially of Zelensky, of what a Trump administration could mean.
But as I was mentioning, the G7, a group of 7 wealthy democracies currently meeting in Italy, and support for Ukraine has been a key topic of the meeting so far. The G7 has agreed to a $50 billion loan to help Ukraine in its fight for survival. Interest earned on profits from Russia's frozen central bank assets would be used as collateral. Details of this deal are still being hashed out. The money, though, could potentially reach Kyiv before the end of the year. President Biden told reporters at that news conference that the move was part of a historic agreement. Ukraine's President Zelensky said providing a loan through Russia's assets is, quote, a vital step forward in providing sustainable support for Ukraine in winning this war. Most of the money would be in the form of a loan, mostly guaranteed by the U.S. government, backed again by profits being earned on roughly $260 billion in immobilized Russian assets.
Yeah, the big question is whether this is legal. Officials from countries have debated the legality here. This is sort of Robin Hood, right? They're confiscating from Russia here as part of the sanctions and then sending it off to Ukraine. They froze the assets. They've been sitting in a bank for a while. Some have said, actually, this is huge leverage to get a deal with Putin. We shouldn't spend all this money or give it to Ukraine because we could use it as part of a deal saying, hey, Putin, if you do X, Y, or Z, we will give you these assets back. So the legal question here, while the governments can generally freeze property or funds without difficulty, turning them into forfeited assets that can be used for Ukraine is a potential legal issue. Again, we're talking about almost $300 billion here. Jill, the larger issue, and this is where the Trump criticism resonates with people, is what is the solution here? What is the end game 2.5 years into this war? That's still unclear. They continue to give aid to Zelensky. The battle lines are still there. There hasn't been much movement as this war continues. Russia continues to control about 20% of Ukraine, and so they've been making some minor moves there. And the world continues to aid Ukraine here with no real end game. Zelensky doesn't plan to give anything up, but ultimately in any sort of compromise or end of war, given the Russian position here, he will. And so pending a Trump presidency, a Trump victory here, that could change things, especially as the war at that point would be just after a Trump inauguration would be at 3 years at that point.
Switching gears, this story from The Hill. They were too hands off. That is the admission from the head of the FAA yesterday. He told Congress that the agency failed to adequately oversee Boeing and that it should have had better visibility into the plane manufacturer's safety practices long before that door panel blew off a plane while it was in flight on January 5th. Mike Whitaker, the agency's administrator, appeared before the Senate weeks after Boeing, which has experienced a spate of problems, submitted a comprehensive plan detailing how it would overhaul its quality control practices and safety culture.
Yeah, so the FAA Administrator Whitaker said the changes include a whole variety of things, including permanently increasing the FAA's use of in-person inspections and barring Boeing from increasing production of the 737 MAX jets until the FAA is satisfied with all of their quality control and safety improvements. That includes maintaining a presence at one of its suppliers, Spirit Aerosystems. Remember, as we've learned more and more about what happened on that Alaska Airlines jet earlier this year, they had extra screws loose that were never reinstalled on the plane when they took that door panel off and put it back on. And so that was extremely concerning here. Questions about how cozy the FAA and Boeing relationship is. So certainly the FAA has come under questions there and hopes here that they will up the scrutiny here because apparently they let a lot of things pass at Boeing.
Moshe, somebody who covered very closely the aftermath of those 2 Boeing 737 crashes in 2018 and 2019, more than 300 people were killed. I find it just unbelievable that this is still an issue because at the time there had been tons of exposés which showed this very thing was already happening, that the FAA was way too cozy with Boeing, that in fact Boeing workers that were going over some of the safety protocols and telling the FAA that it was safe. There was just so much, the relationship was just so incestuous, for lack of a better word. And the fact that all of these years later, it's not fixed is just, it's incredibly frustrating as just an American, as somebody who flies these planes. And I can't imagine how people who lost loved ones in those crashes must be feeling upon hearing that.
Yeah, and we should note that the relationship between regulators and companies, it's not just in aviation between the FAA and Boeing. When you talk about the SEC and major banks, when you talk about the FDA and the CDC and pharmaceutical companies, there's a lot of back and forth that officials do. You become the leader of one, you go back and forth. And so we see this across the government, and this is something that they're constantly trying to tighten up and do a better job of.
From Bloomberg, this is a new one. Wells Fargo last month fired over a dozen employees after reviewing allegations that they were involved in pretending to work by using simulated keyboard activity. The fired staffers worked in the bank's wealth and investment management unit, according to the report. A spokesperson said Wells Fargo holds employees to the highest standards and does not tolerate unethical behavior. It is unclear from the financial disclosures whether the employees Wells Fargo fired were allegedly faking active work from home,
or whether they were doing it in the office. Jill, there are a number of industries where they want to track your activity throughout the day. Mo News is not one of those places. We trust our employees are working throughout the day. I'm not tracking your keyboard movements, but apparently in some places they are. Jill, if you ever have a Bloomberg terminal, when I worked at Bloomberg, you'd have a different color next to your name based on how recently you were at your computer, and that's something your bosses could track. There was I think at the time it was like orange or yellow. People with Bloomberg terminals, the financial terminals, would know. And so I remember that being a thing, at least when I was there over a decade ago. So in recent years, especially with COVID and people working from home, there are devices and software that imitate employee activity known as mouse movers or mouse jigglers. They took off during the pandemic. You can buy them from Amazon and other places for like $20. People are talking about them on Reddit and TikTok. And so if you have a job where they want to show that you're busy moving, apparently you can get one of these things, these mouse jigglers from Amazon. They're like, oh, they're very active today. So we don't have the hard details on what these Wells Fargo employees were doing. We just know from the financial disclosure that they were fired.
All right, people, no fake working. I guess that's the lesson.
Or get smarter in how you fake the work.
From the New York Times, it turns out space changes your body, even during short trips off the planet. 4 people who spent just 3 days off of Earth in September of 2021 experienced physical and mental changes that included modest declines in cognitive tests, stressed immune systems, and genetic changes within their cells. The data comes from a package of papers published on Tuesday in the journal Nature and several other related journals. Almost all of what changed in the astronauts did return to normal after they came back to Earth, according to the study. None of the alterations appear to pose a show-stopping caution for future space travelers, but the results also highlight how little medical researchers know. I guess potentially an issue if we ever are going to live on Mars, as Elon Musk is predicting.
Yes, and I'll get to that in a second, actually, because we got some new data from Mars in recent days from the Mars rover. Jill, for everyone in our audience considering a trip to space anytime soon, I thought this was an important story, but still interesting that even a couple days out there, outside of gravity, changes aspects of your body. And so they studied 4 people who went on this trip a few years ago. They collected samples of blood, saliva, a whole variety of things. And they also tested it against Scott Kelly. You might remember him. He was the NASA astronaut who lived on the International Space Station for 340 days about a decade ago. And during his year in space, age markers in his DNA, known as telomeres, actually grew longer. So he technically, Scott Kelly, nearly a year in space, actually became biologically younger by a bit based on the study of the telomeres. The telomeres are sort of like caps at the end of your shoelaces to protect your chromosomes. And so they showed that he was biologically younger. Again, he returned to Earth and ended up returning to size, and it actually ended up going slightly shorter than before. So then they interpret that as a sign of accelerated aging. So in space, he was biologically younger, returns to Earth, returns to what he was, and then he becomes a little bit older. So there are a lot of questions. We're still learning a lot about space, though people do know that we know more about space than sometimes deep ocean travel sometimes. We've talked about that on the pod before. Jill, I mentioned Mars. You mentioned Mars, and then I mentioned Mars. It turns out, remember we told folks Remember, we were all watching those solar flares recently, where you could see the aurora as south as Florida, as we got those major solar flares on Earth. Well, they also got them on Mars. And it turns out because Mars has a very thin atmosphere, we have an atmosphere, they don't have much of an atmosphere on Mars, and has no global magnetic shield. NASA's Curiosity rover took the full impact of the solar flares over on Mars and tested it, and it was the equivalent of 30 chest x-rays on Mars. So while the solar flares hit Earth, we have an atmosphere, the magnetic shield, etc. So here on Earth, we didn't experience that. If you were on Mars getting the solar flares, you got 30 chest x-rays. Now, of course, there's no humans there, but we would like to send them there. So that's some new data points as we consider sending folks there in the next decade of how we might need to protect them.
I'm just picturing everyone walking around wearing those things like when you get teeth x-rays and they cover you from the neck down.
Hopefully, Jill, I imagine
they're heavy.
We'll need something more. Yeah, well, I imagine we'll need very heavy suits on Mars.
It's not going to be very comfortable.
Jill, NASA's calling on line 1. They like your idea.
And finally, from ESPN, as we end commencement season, some remarks from an athlete getting attention for not being controversial. Tennis star Roger Federer spoke to graduates at Dartmouth over the weekend. The 20-time Grand Slam winner, who hung up his professional racket in 2022, said that he graduated tennis rather than retired, and like those he was speaking to, had finished one big thing and was moving on to the next. He delivered 3 tennis lessons, his words, that he has relied on. 1, effortless is a myth. 2, don't dwell on lost points. And 3, life is bigger than the court. Take a listen.
The truth is, whatever game you play in life, sometimes you're going to lose. A point, a match, a season, a job. It's a roller coaster with many ups and downs. And it's natural when you're down to doubt yourself and to feel sorry for yourself. And by the way, your opponents have self-doubt too. Don't ever forget that. But negative energy is wasted energy. You want to become a master at overcoming hard moments. That is, to me, the sign of a champion.
Moshe, I loved this address because I am a huge Roger Federer fan. And I will say it did look effortless when he would play. And obviously, I feel bad that I even ever thought that. Because
effortless
clearly,
tennis. Yeah.
he's not even trying.
That was a lot of work. That was a lot of work. And he explained in the speech later that you can work harder than you thought possible and still lose. Perfection is impossible. And so, Jill, I like the message, though. Negative energy is wasted energy. Don't dwell on it. Obviously, there's lessons to learn, but you got to move on to the next point. And so, nice remarks from Federer there. He told all the students there, if they ever see him, to say hi. He said this is only the second time he's ever stepped foot on a college campus, and was surprised they were making him a doctor. You know how they make commencement speakers doctors of stuff? He's like, you're giving me a doctorate degree, and I've only been on a college campus twice in my life, but I get to go home as Dr. Roger. That's a pretty nice bonus, he told them.
Moshe, it is Friday. You know what that means. Cheers to the freaking weekend. Time for what we are watching, reading, and eating. What are you watching?
So NBA Finals, we could see the Celtics sweep tonight against the Mavericks. So checking that out. And Jill, honestly, I don't plan to watch much this weekend. Father's Day weekend. Going to enjoy the fam. Jill, what are you watching?
I will be watching this new documentary. It's called Brats. It is about the Brat Pack. It's on Hulu. Emilio Estevez, Demi Moore, Rob Lowe, and others are featured in this documentary about this infamous circle of young Hollywood stars in the 1980s. And so far, it's getting some really good reviews.
Jill, getting some attention, Molly Ringwald decided not to partake in the Brat documentary. Do
we know why?
Andrew McCarthy was asked about it and said that he brought it up to her, and then she just never really responded. Sometimes, like Roger Federer, you don't want to linger on points. You just want to kind of move on to the next thing. And it sounds like both Judd Nelson and Molly Ringwald have been like, you know what? We're good.
She's like, really? The 80s? Like, we're rehashing it? It's over. Let's go.
40 years ago. I'm done.
What are we, Jill Wagner, who's still in the 90s? Like, come on.
Jill, when we do the Mo News documentary in a few years, I hope you partake. What are you reading this weekend?
I'm going to be reading Uncomfortable Conversations with a Jew by Emmanuel Acho and Noah Tishby. who we happen to be interviewing on Monday for a premium edition of the podcast. I cannot wait. I already started it, and it is a fascinating and really honest and candid conversation about race, religion. I'm learning a lot. So far, so good. I'm only a couple of chapters in.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. They're an interesting combination. Acho, obviously a former football player. Then he turned, and then he did a whole bunch around anti-racism and Black Lives Matter, and is now engaged in these conversations with Noah Tishby, discussing race, discussing religion, especially in light of what's been happening the past few months. So looking forward to having them on. We'll have that on a premium podcast coming soon. Also coming to premium podcast, Jill, what I'm reading this weekend, I just did another read of Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, the very much talked about author. He's with Tom Hanks, he's with Oprah, he's with everybody. I had the chance to speak with him about that book. So that's also coming to your premium pod next week. If you aren't a member of Mo News Premium, well, get on board. Mo.news/free trial to check it out for 2 weeks. They give you access to our members only Instagram and podcast and all these great conversations we got coming up.
Okay, Moshe, what are we eating?
Jill, it's National Bourbon Day today. So less eating, more sipping some bourbon. I've always been a Woodford person, but I'm always open to new suggestions. If any of you are bourbon people, send me a message. Let me know what bourbon you're liking these days. I know there's like Pappy Van Winkle's like a famous one that's like really hard to get a hold of. It's gotten really pricey, etc. So that's what I have going on. Plus whatever we do on Father's Day.
The thought of bourbon like just burns my chest.
You're not a brown liquor person.
No.
Okay. Jill,
as
what
my
are you
husband calls it, the brown water.
Jill, what are you drinking or eating this weekend?
Birthday cake. Obviously.
Chocolate? Are you a chocolate birthday cake person?
Funny you ask, because my tastes have really changed. And I'd say within the past few years, I'm now into vanilla. I always loved chocolate, like absolutely everything chocolate ice cream, down the line. Yeah. And now it's all things vanilla. My husband is also taking me out for dinner to this restaurant I've been dying to try called Selena in Oyster Bay Cove. It's really small. It only has like 40 seats. So it's hard to get a reservation, kind of like old school Italian. And I'm very psyched for that.
All right. So you get celebrated for your birthday, and then you get to celebrate Michael for Father's Day.
That's right. And to all the dads out there, including my dad and my husband and Moshe, you as well, happy Father's Day. Hope you enjoy your day.
Yes, happy Father's Day, Abba. He doesn't really listen. My father doesn't really listen to the podcast, but my mom does. And so she'll make sure he hears this.
Charlie Wanunu, come on.
Charlie has his own media diet. He gets direct analysis from me on the phone.
It's okay. I mention my brother all the time on the podcast. He never mentions it. He never listens. It's okay. It's like if a tree falls in the woods.
It's like my brother. My brother also doesn't listen. My sister-in-law listens and then tells him when I mention him. So happy birthday. But so happy Father's Day to my brother. Emily, make sure Yoni finds out that I said I wish him a happy Father's Day.
All right, everybody. Have a really wonderful weekend. Thank you for listening. Share this episode. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss out on all we've got going on.
See you guys.